What if the voice you've trusted your entire life isn't actually yours? The voice that tells you you're not good enough, not smart enough, not attractive enough. The voice that appears whenever you fail, hesitate, or dream too big. Most people spend their entire lives obeying this voice without ever asking a terrifying question. Who is really speaking inside my mind? It sounds like you. It uses your voice. It knows your fears. But appearances can be deceptive, because long before you knew who you were, long before you formed your own identity, other voices were already shaping the landscape of your mind. And many of them never left. Maybe you've experienced it. You make a small mistake, and suddenly an avalanche of criticism erupts inside your head. The reaction feels strangely disproportionate. It's as if someone else has taken over the microphone. In those moments, you're not simply evaluating yourself. You're reliving something much older. Carl Jung understood something most people never discover. The mind is not a single, unified thing. Beneath your conscious awareness lives an entire hidden world. Forgotten memories, repressed emotions, internalized judgments, invisible forces that quietly influence how you see yourself. And one of the most powerful forces hiding there is what psychologists often call the inner critic. But here's the unsettling truth. The inner critic is rarely born from your authentic self. More often, it is a collection of voices absorbed from the people and environments that shaped you. Think back to childhood. A careless comment, a harsh criticism, a moment of embarrassment. Perhaps someone repeatedly told you that you were too sensitive, too emotional, too loud, or never quite enough. At the time, those words came from outside, but eventually they moved in. Years passed, faces changed, circumstances changed, yet the voice remained. Now it sounds familiar, almost natural, so natural that you mistake it for your own thoughts. But familiarity does not prove ownership. This is where many people become trapped. They spend years fighting the voice, arguing with it, trying to silence it. But they never stop to investigate its origins. And without understanding where it came from, they remain prisoners of its influence. But there's another layer to this story, a deeper one. Sometimes the voice becomes strongest precisely when you're moving toward growth. Right before a new opportunity, right before love, right before change. As if something inside you is trying to keep you small. Most people assume the voice is protecting them from failure, but often it is protecting them from uncertainty. The unknown threatens old psychological patterns, and those patterns would rather keep you familiar and miserable than unfamiliar and free. Jung observed that whatever remains unconscious can quietly direct our lives from behind the scenes. The tragedy is that we often mistake these hidden influences for our own identity. We don't just hear the voice, we become it. Maybe that's why compliments make you uncomfortable. Why success feels undeserved. Why does every achievement quickly dissolve into self-doubt? The critical voice isn't interested in truth. It's interesting in preserving an old story about who you are. And here's the paradox. The more you obey the voice, the stronger it becomes. Every act of surrender confirms its authority. Every avoided risk becomes evidence that it was right all along. Most people never realize they're living inside a psychological echo chamber. They hear the same criticism so often that it begins to feel like objective reality. But repetition is not proof. An old wound, repeated 1,000 times, is still a wound. And that leads to the question most people never ask. If this voice is not truly me, then who am I beneath it? That question marks the beginning of a journey, and what lies ahead may change everything you thought you knew about yourself. The moment you begin questioning the voice, something unusual happens. A small distance appears between you and the criticism. For the first time, you are not fully immersed in the experience. You are observing it. And that tiny shift may be one of the most important psychological discoveries a person can make. Imagine hearing a stranger speak to a child the way your inner critic speaks to you. You would probably recognize it immediately as cruel, unfair, or even abusive. Yet when those same words appear inside your own mind, they often pass without question. Carl Jung believed that parts of ourselves are often pushed into the shadows of the psyche, not because they are bad, but because we learned at some point that they were unacceptable. Our anger, our vulnerability, our needs, our authentic feelings. Carl Jung believed that parts of ourselves are often pushed into the shadows of the psyche, not because they are bad, but because we learned at some point that they were unacceptable. Our anger, our vulnerability, our needs, our authentic feelings. Perhaps you learned that expressing sadness made you weak. Maybe showing anger made people uncomfortable. Maybe asking for love led to rejection. So you adapted. You hid pieces of yourself, not because you wanted to, but because you believed you had to. The tragedy is that the inner critic often becomes the guard, protecting these hidden rooms. It constantly warns you not to speak, not to risk, not to reveal too much. Its real job is not growth. Its real job is control. And this explains a mystery many people struggle to understand. Why do you feel exhausted even when nothing terrible is happening? Because fighting yourself all day requires enormous energy. Internal conflict is one of the most draining experiences a human being can endure. There is another layer most people never see. The critic doesn't only attack your weaknesses, it also attacks your strengths. It questions your talents. It minimizes your achievements. It whispers that your success was luck and your confidence is arrogance. Why? Because growth threatens the identity built around limitation. If you've spent years believing you're not worthy, every success challenges that story. And stories rarely disappear without resistance. This is why transformation often feels uncomfortable. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're leaving familiar psychological territory. The mind prefers certainty, even when that certainty causes suffering. Many people spend decades trying to eliminate the inner critic. But what if the goal is not destruction? What if the goal is understanding? Because enemies become less frightening once their true nature is revealed. Because beneath the harshness, beneath the fear, beneath the endless criticism, there is often an old wound trying desperately to protect itself. A younger version of you that learned the world could be painful, unpredictable, or unsafe. Maybe the voice believes criticism will prevent rejection. Maybe it believes perfection will guarantee love. Maybe it thinks constant vigilance will prevent future pain. The problem is that protection strategies from childhood often become prisons in adulthood. And here is the realization that changes everything. If the voice was learned, it can also be questioned. If it was conditioned, it can be re-examined. If it was inherited, it does not have to become your destiny. But before true freedom becomes possible, there is something deeper waiting to be uncovered. A hidden psychological force that keeps the critic alive. A force Jung spent much of his life exploring, and once you see it, you may never look at yourself the same way again. The force Jung explored was something he called the shadow. Not a monster hiding inside you, not a dark secret waiting to destroy your life. The shadow is far more complicated than that. It is the collection of everything you learned to hide, reject, suppress, or deny, to be accepted by the world around you. Most people assume the shadow contains only negative traits, but often it contains some of the most valuable parts of who you are. The confidence you never expressed, the creativity you were afraid to share, the courage you buried beneath years of self-doubt. And this is where the inner critic becomes especially dangerous. It convinces you that hiding these parts is wisdom. It tells you not to speak too loudly, not to dream too boldly, not to stand out, not to risk judgment. It mistakes invisibility for safety. Think about the moments when you felt most alive. The moments when you forgot to perform, impress, or protect yourself. The moments when you simply existed. Chances are the critical voice was silent, because authenticity and self-judgment rarely occupy the same space. But there is another hidden player in this story. Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to earn approval, acceptance, and belonging. The persona is not fake, it serves a purpose, but problems begin when the mask becomes more familiar than the face beneath it. Many people spend years becoming who they think they should be. The responsible one, the strong one, the successful one, the agreeable one. Meanwhile, the authentic self waits quietly in the background, hoping someday to be invited back into the conversation. And perhaps that's why the critical voice becomes louder whenever authenticity begins to emerge. It senses a threat, not to your well-being, but to the old identity it has spent years defending. This is the paradox of transformation. The closer you move toward becoming yourself, the more resistance you may encounter from within. Not because you are failing, but because old patterns are fighting for survival. Most people interpret this resistance as proof they should stop, but often it is evidence that they are finally approaching something important. Growth rarely feels comfortable to the parts of us built around fear. And then, one day, a realization begins to emerge. The voice is speaking, but you are the one listening. The criticism is appearing, but you are the one observing. Suddenly, the voice is no longer your identity. It becomes an experience of passing through awareness. That distinction changes everything. Because what you can observe, you do not have to obey. What you can question, you do not have to become. Awareness creates freedom where unconsciousness creates captivity. Jung called this process individuation. The lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are, rather than who fear, conditioning, or expectation tells you to be. Not perfection, not superiority, simply wholeness. Wholeness does not mean the critic disappears forever. It means you recognize it for what it is: an old voice, an old strategy, an old wound, something that may still appear, but no longer controls the direction of your life. And perhaps the greatest freedom is this: you no longer need to spend your life proving the critic wrong. You no longer need to earn your worth. You no longer need permission to exist as yourself. So the next time that familiar voice appears and tells you that you are not enough, pause for a moment. Listen carefully. Ask yourself whose voice it truly is. Because the most important voice you will ever hear is not the one that judges you. It is the quiet voice beneath the noise, the voice that has been waiting your entire life to be heard. And perhaps for the first time, you are finally ready to listen.